Welcome back to the channel. This is Drawing Comics with CT Guy. If you want to check out my Instagram, it's right here. And if you need to send me an email, you can do that at ctguy.comics@gmail.com. I'll put a link in the description below for you as well. Let's get into some digital inking. I've had a couple of people ask about my workflow previously, and honestly, it can kind of vary depending on what I'm working on. I have recently been working initial sketches anyway on paper, and then moving the sketch into Comic Draw, which is an app by Plask. I'm not in business with them. I just found that the drawing environment is a little bit more streamlined than some of the others and much more affordable for my purposes. As you can see, I work the sketch back and forth using red and blue pencils before I put the inks in. The red and blue is a technique that has been used for a long time in both animation and comic art, or some people would say sequential art. After I finish inking, I'll sometimes lay down either gray tones or color, or if my inks are bold enough, I'll just leave it. I think there really is a fine line though, and a risk of either over or underworking an image. That's, I guess, the eternal struggle, I suppose. I've always liked Iron Man as a character way before the Marvel movies came out. I am partial to superheroes that don't have actual powers like Iron Man and Batman. I feel like it adds a level of higher stakes that always isn't present with other characters, like, say, Superman, where he can do all kinds of things and his powers almost seem unlimited sometimes. I also really do like Iron Man for the story plots that some of the writers have developed over the years. I mean, of course, there's even the classic one, the Demon in the Bottle storyline, which I thought was pretty awesome. I don't really read as much of the newer Iron Man stuff, and I haven't read anything with the Riri Williams, so I'm kind of interested in checking those out at some point and seeing how they are. But let me know in the comments who your favorite comic superhero is, or maybe your favorite Iron Man storyline, and I can check those ones out. Maybe just let me know why you think they're interesting. My approach to this page was to have a lot of space to kind of let the image breathe and get a sense of like open flight for Iron Man. That's one thing I have liked about this character, where because of his suit, he can sort of take off and land almost anywhere, but it's kind of an unlimited sort of flight potential, which I think is really good for when you're doing movement inside of a page. When I was initially thinking about this, I guess it's a splash page, or it could even potentially be a cover. Sometimes those are one and the same, I kind of feel like. But I opted for an older version of Iron Man's armor, and kind of taking more inspiration from the comics. The cinema armor feels very different to me than the comics version. It's not that I don't like the newer designs, I think they're really good and they really translate well for the big screen. And I know that sometimes when you're working on something for comics, it really does need to be kind of reworked. Just because there's a different expectation, I feel, when people are going to the movie theater versus picking up comic books. I just think it doesn't always translate well to comics back and forth. Maybe I'm just a bit nostalgic about the sort of 80s and 90s styles of armors, who knows. So you can see I'm working back and forth with layers. One of the things I really find helpful when I'm working in a digital format is that uh, the layers, I can go to a layer below the one I'm currently working on, and the software recognizes where the lines are intersecting. And so when I go to lay down some blacks, I don't have to sit there and use an ink brush, obviously, like I normally do when I'm working in an analog or in paper. I can just tap and then it will fill in those spaces. Now that doesn't mean it's perfect, of course, and you got to go back in and sort of clean up some areas, but I would have to normally do that anyway. So I find when I'm inking of just like pure speed, it's really tough to beat digital inking. However, there's something a little bit exploratory when you're doing this with actual brushes, or I use a lot of Sakura pens, and I find that um, my decision making for that is more finalized, obviously, because if you got to stop and use whiteout to make a correction, it slows your process down a little bit more, and your output slows down as well. But you can even see there's a little bit of tap method I can use on Comic Draw. You just use 2 fingers, and then I can quickly undo something. So if I throw it on a line or pull a line and it's not quite what I'm looking for, or I just want to refine it a little bit more, I can just double tap, erase that one line, and I can go back in and keep redoing it. And of course, sometimes, depending on what I'm doing, I will also use the eraser a little bit. But if it's just one single line, I can go back and do it. So metal, when you're rendering it out and you're trying to make it look a little bit more metallic, sometimes these wavy lines that you can see in between are really effective. And of course, depending on what you're working on, some artists are much better at rendering things that are metallic, or maybe they're more organic, that sort of thing. Like it just really depends on how you approach it, and the more time you spend with it, the easier it kind of gets. If I'm being honest, I'm sure I must have got some of my inspiration drawing metal things from those '90s comics. There's so much metal in them that is kind of mind-boggling. But I always remembered things like how certain artists would render it, especially with the early Image comic stuff. Uh, wasn't as, I suppose, the older style comics like John Buscema, as an example. His stuff was amazing, but I feel like there was such a drastic change from his style of work compared to the big shift in the '90s. And of course, I was reading like the '90s. I would pick up things like Cyber Frog and all that kind of stuff, and that had like a lot of interesting metallic rendering in it. I think that was by Harris Comics, actually. All right, so I actually do the backgrounds in a separate layer, and depending on my mood at the time, I will either work the backgrounds first or I'll work the figures first. In this instance, obviously, I worked the character first, and then I went into the backgrounds. Um, you learn something new all the time, but I used to sometimes struggle with backgrounds, like fully visualizing it, relying a lot on just perspective blocks and stuff. And I still tend to do that sometimes as well. And I'm always very aware of how the perspective looks. And I tend to almost always put a background in, even if it's off to the side, because I feel like it just makes the image a lot more believable. But I was watching an animation channel, and they were talking about how they were using um, Google Maps, like Street View, to get more inspiration for their architecture. And I started doing that recently, and it's very, very helpful to sort of sell it, especially in a specific location. Like, I mean, if Spider-Man's in New York and you want inspiration for New York, but maybe you want like modern day New York, well, going to the Street View on Google Maps is incredibly helpful to help you visualize the compactness of certain city streets in New York. And obviously, I don't live in New York, and I never will probably live in New York, but um, getting a sense of that and being true to the character and where the character's environment is, I think is helpful as a comic artist. It just really helps to establish that that character is living there. So I took inspiration from this Avengers Tower from the films. So here I am talking about how I took more inspiration from the comics to do Iron Man as the character in this versus the cinema. But then I found that I really liked the look of the new Avengers Towers because it just sort of updated it. If I used older comics to really look at the Avengers Tower, I think it would sort of date it immediately. So I like that kind of push and pull between the older style comics and like the newer cinematic universe as well. All right, everyone, we're coming up to the end of the video here. Make sure you click a like and subscribe to help support the channel. Also check out my Instagram. Here's the final image. Just black and white right now. I might get around to coloring it later on. Alright, I hope you have an excellent day, and I'll see you in the next video.